Going to talk propaganda and subversion. It was a comment that George Orwell wrote in his essay on Dickens. And he wrote also that even if the artist doesn't know it, all art is propaganda, which I think is a bit extreme. And I wanted to look at some of the paintings here at the Fitzwilliam and see how it would fit in. And the object, therefore, is to look at paintings where the artist has motives that aren't always obvious in what we first notice in their painting. We'll look at a dozen or so of their paintings, very celebrated artists, Martini, Bruegel, Rubens, Titian, Domenico Veneziano, and it shows actually the depth, the richness of this permanent collection. And we'll look at those paintings in their social context. I just wanted to explain that art is full of politics in many places in Cambridge, none more so than the Parker Library. At Corpus Christi College, here's a picture of, on the right, of Archbishop Parker for 25 years up to his death in the mid-1570s, and the library that was made to hold his books, which he'd collected, really as a political exercise. And it's a wonderful cultural resource. It's undoubtedly all about politics. And what he was trying to show is that everything went wrong from the first moment we joined Europe in 1066. And that it was his job to find books, typically like this, translated into English from the Latin that Gregory had written in, instructing English bishops how to behave. It was Alfred doing the instruction. So it was about persuasion and precedent that this library was used to embed the Elizabethan settlement where we became a Protestant nation. Even this building is full of politics. This is the outside view. I want you to look at the frieze above there, which is blown up here, and you see Athena in the centre, facing east, as she does in Athens. And it is a copy of the frieze around the Parthenon. And you see Athena there and Athena further down. And the moment when we have to hand over the Elgin marbles, the next best copy of the frieze will be around here, the first Gallery 3 upstairs in this museum. The whole place is built as a replica of the Parthenon on the Acropolis. And you came up from the road level, up the hill as if it were the Acropolis. Our first floor is not the first, the ground floor in normal context. And it was England posturing to be the successor of the culture and the civilization of Athens. And what have we got 500 yards up the road to the north? The Senate House. So we claim to be the heir of Rome as well, no matter that France and Germany and the Americans were doing the same thing at the same time in the 19th century. The most overtly political structure, of course, is King's Chapel. And nowhere is politics more evident than in the stained glass. To give you two examples there, first is its position as a PR zone for the Tudor dynasty. There are portraits of Henry VI in the southern side chapel, Henry VII, window 2 in the north side. Here it's the marriage of Tobias, symbolising the marriage of Tobias and Sarah, and then a young Henry VIII and a mature Henry VIII. And there are references to 4 of the women of the Tudor dynasty. There's a window here along the north side, halfway down towards the altar, where you have the temptation scene. And it's showing here the devil dressed in the costumes of a Catholic friar, very blunt Catholic, anti-Catholic prejudice. Focusing on the figure of Jesus, though, I want to show you there's more behind this propaganda. The pictures themselves were directed by the highest people in the land, the Chancellor, Richard Fox, and others right at the apex of English society in the 16th century. But the artists were still able to impose what they thought was important and reflect two of the characteristics of the High Renaissance period, this horror of empty spaces, and to express personal views of humanity and nature. So with that star I've attached there, you see there's a spider. If you look further down, there's a cat, a rabbit there, a cat there, and off screen, in fact, a porcupine or a hedgehog further down. Now, there's no way the top people in the country would have imposed this sort of restriction. They would have said, make the devil out to be a Roman Catholic priest, but they wouldn't have done this. So you can see there are other details in the art coming out as well. And I think this is the artist being independent. The artist is propagandist. The word actually comes from Pope Gregory XV in the 1620s, and it was directly from the Latin, which I put up there, Congregation for Propagating the Faith. And it was only years later that it began to have a negative connotation. Incidentally, Samuel Johnson makes no mention of it. Maybe it was too Catholic a word. The Oxford English Dictionary in 33 does define it, but not in a negative sense. So it was Goebbels and others who gave it the negative connotations. And interestingly, John Paul II, 20, 30 years ago, actually replaced the word with evangelical. So it was no longer, obviously it was the connotations of the word were too deep. So that's how I'm talking about propaganda. And subversion is more obvious. But again, I think there are more positive messages. Propaganda should be the spread of a message, not the Goebbels interpretation, and subversive, perhaps one who challenges. If you go to the gallery upstairs, the Rothschild Gallery, at the moment at least you can see this gilded silver basin put out there from the 1550s. It's in a kind of mannerist, exaggerated style, and 100 years later, this one here. They're actually very rare because of the melts that Louis XIV had at the end of his reign, late 1600s, when he was short of money to support his empire. And many of the nobles were persuaded to have them melted down. But originally their purpose was as much propagandist as it was beautiful art, because these would be on display to visiting ambassadors from other countries, and they would represent wealth and ease of melting down to pay Swiss mercenaries or whoever. So it was very much a dual purpose there. Going upstairs to the Upper Marley Gallery, you have a picture I understand was the favourite of Duncan Robinson when he was here. Simone Martini from Siena, painting in the early 1300s. He was thought to be responsible for the emerging Gothic style, and you can certainly see the detail. I'll blow them up in larger size in a moment, their beards and their clothes and other detail that would set the scene for the Renaissance period. One thing that always strikes me is that these paintings upstairs are presented in a very unnatural way. Far more natural would have been the Walsingham Cathedral, 20th century. So you would look at Simone Martini's painting in this sort of context, where you can begin to imagine how moving it might be when you were praying before it. This painting, though, apparently was it's a triptych to you and I. Apparently it should be a pentateuch. There were 5 of them. There are two pieces missing. But it shows an immense pessimism and hardness, I think, from the Catholic Church. In 1243, the Catholics had come up with this most wonderful fundraising scheme known as Purgatory, and it was the Council of Lyon, and they were really enforcing this position, because can you see here, how, apart from how miserable they are, how the scales from St. Michael, who determine which of us got into heaven, are weighed against you. The good side is on the right, his right is outweighing the bad side. So you're not destined unless you improve your ways to get into heaven. This is St. Augustine of Hippo. He died, I think, 400 or 500s, but you have in the 1250s the starting off of the Augustinian friars and wearing the black piece there. And this is the patron saint of St. Gimignano, the Geminanus, I think, just to the southwest of Florence. And the Augustine friars, incidentally, were in Cambridge. They were just behind, east of Free School Lane, and their buildings there survived until the Reformation, and they were pulled down, and much of the stonework was used to make Great St Mary's, which I hadn't realised until recently. And the grounds of their friary there became the first botanical garden before it moved in the 1800s to its present place. But can you see that there's no room for spiders? You're absolutely focused on the issue of salvation and behaving according to the church's tenets. Looking just out of interest at them more carefully, I mean, you see it's all pretty miserable, isn't it? Looking down, and I think that is really showing very strong propagandist tendencies, that the Simone Martini didn't have a choice. I wouldn't, you or I, if we could have painted, would have done the same. There was no patronage beyond the church. This was the period before the before the Italian city-states had gathered wealth and become strong enough to be secure, to have other patrons. If you wanted to paint and have your expensive chemicals for the painting funded, this is what you had to do. And Martini was capable of other painting. These are on the frescoes at of the chapels in Assisi of St. Francis. You can see there's some kind of lovely expressions, actually even rather cheerful around here, but not for this one. Wanted to move to Domenico Veneziano, and this is the one, along with possibly the Titian, the most famous painting we have in the Fitzwilliam. And I've seen David Grace occasionally in the past, when he was in charge of paintings, come through, and with some big wig or other, he would always stop straight away in the Upper Marley Gallery to look at this painting. It's what's known as a sacred conversation, Sacri Conversazione. There were 5 of them. There's another one as well, St. Zenobius, who raised people from the dead, kind of Lazarus-like, and there are 2 others, one in Germany and one in America. And the altarpiece, the larger painting above, is in the Uffizi Museum in Florence. It's the most central moment of Christianity. There's a bit of the painting that's been lopped off in its history over here. It's lost a bit of the balance. And its importance, I think, to history of art students is the use of perspective. If you go online to the museum's website, you'll see it full of lines going straight into the centre of this door, which leads to the secret garden, the Hortus Conclusus behind. But it has more in there. These are just a reminder here of pointing upwards, you see, with the hand gestures to the painting above it. It's in the church, it was meant for the church of St. Lucia del Magnolia, just to the north side of the Arno, of the bridge Ponte Vecchio over the Arno. I think, well, certainly when I was last there, the church is shut, but I don't know whether it might be open now. And I wanted to show you how famous it was, because the lovely sister Wendy, when she was on television, actually came here and stood in front of it. I mean, it really is vital. I've known, well, one recently, an art student who would mean to recognise the painting, but when they were here with me, they hadn't actually known it was here. They said, oh, this is where it is. I mean, they do all study it. But what I wanted to focus on was this extra bit of propaganda coming in, which is above the door, larger here. And this comes on to the crenellations, or I know now, because I'm possibly a page ahead of you than you in Wikipedia, they're known as merlons in architectural speak. And merlon it comes from the Italian for pitching fork. And you and I would think of those as being a normal crenellation on a castle. But here you see a different shape. Do you see? a different shape. And that is the picture blown up at the back. You see? So I'm talking at that bit there, and you can have a look, if you wish, upstairs. And these different type of merlons or crenellations relate to the Ghibelline Guelph War that tore Italian society apart for 300 years from 1200. The Guelphs supported the Holy Roman Emperor, thinking that this lay institution should have more power, and the Ghibellines were for the Pope and the Papal States. And countries throughout, towns throughout Italy supported one or the other. Generally, Florence was a Guelph city, controlled by the Medici, who was a merchant, and the merchants tended to support the Guelphs. But this is the Ghibelline sign. So we're talking the Ghibellines here. So the patron, who it seems is someone called Niccolo da Uzzano, who lived on the north side of the Ponte Vecchio towards the Pitti Palace, was the probably the patron of Domenico for this painting, and presumably supported this one side of this Italian Civil War. And I just love these little gestures hidden inside, that despite all the overt messages of Christianity, there's time for the artist to listen to the patron and put in these little details. Let me take you across the road to Pembroke Antechapel. Is another example, I think, of propaganda, but where the artist is emerging as an independent person, far more than you could possibly see in Simone Martini. This is an anonymous artist from the 15th century. It certainly doesn't reflect Martini's gloom and doom. And the first thing you see is powerful women. This is Mary intervening with Saint Michael on behalf of another lady here, that you should be opening the gates of heaven for this lady. So it's powerful women. You've got optimism. Can you see how this time the good scales, unlike Martini 150 years earlier, are outweighing the bad signs? And that's not generally a message you get from your medieval history lessons at school. And I've just reminded you here, actually, there, you see how the scales are balanced opposite one side of the road to the other. And there's humour, which I love, because you see here that the devil's acolyte is trying to correct the balance. And yet Mary herself is not above cheating. Can you see here? She's resting her rosary to counterbalance. Now, I just think this is lovely humour that you had not an inkling of 200 years ago. So there's something happening. There's a movement to independent artistic impression. Maybe the artist was painting what he wanted. Maybe he had he had the confidence of a older patron who was independent. Sadly, one doesn't know, and there's no script given with the this piece of alabaster. It's known as Nottingham alabaster. They largely come from the north, and they're few and far between because it's soft marble, I think, geologically, and they break very easily. And we also had our own version of kind of Isis in those days, smashing them around at the time of the Reformation. So there are very few around, but it's there and open to everyone to see across the road. Moving on to Titian, you have his famous Rape of Europa, which was part of his, I think, 7 or 8 series of paintings of poesy, where he thought or struggled to prove that an artist painting with a brush could be the equal or better the writer writing with a pen, that the expression in art was just as powerful. And you have here the Rubens equivalent, and Titian is almost the source of our Renaissance and subsequent painting. They all studied his work. Rubens was a young man, went to Italy for some time and studied there. It was a very political series. This symbolism is about the rape, called the Rape of Europa. This bull, Zeus disguised himself as a bull, takes Europa across the seas and names this new continent. And the analogy was to Charles V of Spain, and his Spain at the most powerful point of its empire, and it was overtly political, painted for Charles V. Later on, he painted, Titian painted for Philip II, you know, he of the Spanish Armada. Our version of Titian, and incidentally I quote this from the painter, is, you see, my desire to close the days of this my extreme old age in the service of the Catholic King, shows this link between artists and their patrons. Whether you can say this is itself so propagandist, I'm not so sure. It's a moment of great Republican triumph, or represents that, because the story from Livy is that Tarquin, the son of King Tarquin the Superb, wishes to rape Lucretia, the aristocratic wife of a fellow soldier, and having sent Lucretia's wife away on some mission, he returns to rape her, and he's going to blame it on the slave hidden here. And this causes the Roman monarchy to fall and the first Brutus to take over. So it's an odd painting to be giving to Philip II. It was painted late in his life. But it again perhaps shows independence, because it's very much a humanist painting. It's going back for inspiration to pre-Christian times, to ancient Rome, for inspiration. And the inspiration he finds is proof that we have free will and reason to make good or bad of our wills. And this is, I think, fairly subversive in the times when the church was laying down exactly what was expected of us, and if we were born poor, we would stay poor and not challenge the status quo. Here you have mankind being able to do what he wanted. Titian set the benchmark for all sorts of painting. This is Charles V, the key battle of Moelburg, which is where the northern European Protestants were destroyed. And in consequence, Van Dyck would paint as well paintings of Charles I, our Stuart king here, mounted on a horse. And they're full of rather kind of offensive comments about him, and I'm not sure this one didn't come from a Guardian journalist, so it can be discounted, but it's describing Charles here as a little stammering man portrayed as a superior being. Be that as it may, we are forced to look up to him. We're looking down, he's on a regal horse, he was under 5 foot, so he's been given some regal presence. Van Dyck was very much a painter of propaganda. And this one I love showing. This is the wife, the French wife, Henrietta Maria, of Charles I, who was painted many times. And Van Dyck painted Charles I something like 50 times, painted this lady 30 times. An astonishing sequence of paintings of, of a single patron. And when this Henrietta Maria's cousin, Princess Sophia of Hanover, first saw Henrietta Maria in real life, she complained that, or in her diary, and the diary is extant, and she complains that Henrietta Maria is far more ugly than the pictures. And she uses this wonderful phrase that in her diary she has uneven shoulders, bony elbows, and teeth that stuck out from her mouth like the guns from the side of a battleship. And I just think that's the most wonderfully unpleasant comment. And then this is a picture of the Electress of Hanover there. But you can't believe these pictures, because Van Dyck is flattering the people who he paints. Upstairs we have this painting by Van Dyck, which is always on the cover of any textbook on the Stuarts, of Archbishop Laud, who died aged 46 in 1641. He was described equally unpleasantly, I think a bit hard as well, that it was a little low, a red-faced man, a ridiculous old bigot obsessed with points of ritual. But whatever it is, this is that truth or anyone near, it is not what Van Dyck is showing. He another small man, he's painted him from beneath. We have to look up to him, and he's bulked him up in a voluminous clerical dress, and actually just the same as the picture upstairs by Augustus John on Thomas Hardy as well, trying to bulk up another small man. And the politics is not only making this man look big, but you see some of the colour that's actually clearer in this picture than it is upstairs in reality. But I'm sure it would have been clearer even still when it was painted. And these represent the colourful ornaments, the frontals for the altar of the Christian church, because his mission was to return the beauty to holiness after the dull reign of the Puritans. And there's a fair amount of politics in there. Even actually the silk and very fine cloth that the Puritans had been less keen to wear. And incidentally, this is one of the reasons why the Cambridge colleges venture into silk production failed. You know, Jesus and Corpus Christi and 1-2 other colleges, they tried to plant mulberries to make a silk industry in Cambridge, and it failed. And one reason was they got the wrong mulberry, another was the climate went bad. The third reason, actually, it went this sort of silk production went out of production and went out of fashion. People didn't want it. 41 copies made in the 17th century of this picture. So again, its propaganda value was obviously appreciated, and that's focusing on there the beauty to holiness. And Van Dyck, as you'll know, was very famous for his quality of his hands. Though there are examples upstairs. He's done a picture which probably is unfinished in the Spanish gallery, where the hands are pretty awful, and it prompted me to mention and honour our founder, the Viscount Fitzwilliam, painted of Right of Derby, and that's the one plausible, to me at least, explanation for the phrase of something costing an arm and a leg, something being very expensive, and you weren't keen to have your painter spend a lot of time on the hands, so you had a hand hidden. I regard that as quite a plausible explanation of that common phrase. Moving from Van Dyck across to Van Orley, slightly earlier period. This is in the Spanish gallery. You can see so much here. He's painting about the Annunciation, but he's not going to be restricted to this very narrow early Renaissance view or theme. And you have a richly dressed carpenter's wife, Mary, just as you do at the King's College Chapel, but you have such wonderful detail. You've got a kind of bedroom back at the side there, which I've blown up. You've got all this detail. Let me show you some more, I think, in the next scene. You've got this cat at the front. You've got a man chopping wood at the back, a nice vista of countryside. I'm not sure where. He's painting in Holland and Belgium, so it's unlikely to be the Low Countries. Another church. He's got a rather unhappy-looking priest up here, and compare this to what you had before. So there's more to life than the single-minded focus on religion, and I find it. I would have thought most of us would find it far more attractive, albeit from a different period. So one's not condemning Simone Martini at all, because he had no choice with patrons. What you have here, particularly in Northern Europe, is far more patrons and choice who would let you paint something else than just a straightforward religious message. And I've just put here, because you can see this is the kind of rather irate looking, in fact, a saint up there, as the rest of the painting and events continue there without him. Bruegel is a thoroughly subversive work. This is the middle Bruegel. There was peasant Bruegel, painting those charming views of peasant weddings and harvest lunch in a harvest field. Then you had Hell Bruegel, one of the son, and I think another son, I sometimes confuse whether it's a nephew, Velvet Bruegel, who painted flowers and things. So this is Hell Bruegel, and it's a message here of confusion. There's no focal point. You don't know where to look. When you do start looking and look at individual bits, you see flirting and drinking and kind of amorous villagers and peasants puking down here. It celebrates the feasts of St. Hubert and St. Anthony. The background, though, is a very unhappy one from the northern states of the Netherlands, which are subjected to brutal rule over a few hundred years from the Spanish. And this is painted 1550s, and it was in the same decade that this Duke of Alba was really crushing the Dutch, and the Spanish admit to 5,000 people were killed in formal executions, let alone in other situations, and the Dutch still maintain today that it was 18,000. So there's a huge kind of chaotic background which is reflected in the painting. St. Hubert is the patron saint of hunting, and St. Anthony of lost mines. Some of us remember if you lost property in the old days, you went to the British Rail lost property office, and they had a symbol of St. Anthony above them: lost mines, lost property. And here you see the tree, which indicates it's spring, so it's a hungry part of the year. You have therefore to be eating the infected grain, which chemists understand, I didn't before looking at this picture, which is infected with a chemical called ergot, E-R-G-O-T, hence they're being sick and whatever. So that's the background, waiting for the new harvest to come in, the background of the brutal Catholic Spanish rule. But there's much more to it. You see up here the church, and there are people having communion, but this church states that no one should start a party on a feast day before everybody has had communion. Well, these guys have been at the party for a long time. This, and you can see down there. Up here you see a man who's actually urinating against the church. Here you have a hedge preacher, what we used to call a hedge preacher, a street preacher. And there seem to be far more people there at the alternative religious service than there are inside. Here you have a medieval masque where the head of the house goes off on a business mission and returns to find his wife misbehaving with another man, and another man is dressed as a Catholic friar. So you have all this knocking of the church. It really is very, very subversive, and I think one of the most charming pictures we have. He made half a dozen pictures, like 5. I tracked one down. There happens to be one in Auckland. You see slightly different, but I thought that was interesting. In that same Spanish gallery, you've got Rubens, and he was very much a politician, more a diplomat. It was much a diplomat as a painter, and he was criticised as a kind of vassal of the Pope and a kind of messenger of the Emperor. And this is St. Teresa Devi of the barefoot Carmelites, which I've just realised that barefoot doesn't mean literally barefoot, it means they wore sandals, not closed shoes. And it's rather always irritated me that they don't share the bare feet or show the feet that seem to be so important. But you can see it's a working woman's hands, isn't it? It's quite a strong set of hands there. And the Spanish Emperor wanted her made into a saint. It was successful by the 1640s, so it's not long after she died. I haven't put her dates in there, but they're about dying late 1500s. And she was canonised then in 1640. You've got the famous Bernini ecstasy of Teresa at the Cornello church in chapel in Rome, which is particularly famous as well. It's a fine example of propaganda, and as you don't know where to look with this last picture of Bruegel, there's no doubt where you should be looking. Here, it's also been Teresa Devi has also been a lifelong love of Archbishop Williams. And he, I think, did his PhD in kind of inward prayer and contemplation on her. And I've listened to a recent lecture, a very eloquent lecture he gave about her as well. Rubens, on one of his diplomatic missions, came to England, painted the Whitehall ceiling, of course, and he was knighted and given an honoured degree at Cambridge. And I don't know whether he actually came up to Cambridge for it. I suspect he didn't, or we'd probably know about it. Again, there were more pictures of this one in his campaign to help her canonisation. That one's in Rotterdam. Then I wanted to move across in the same room of the Spanish Gallery, upstairs, and look at these two pictures. I really do think show a difference between the north and south in character. You had this one by Morales, who was painting, I don't know the painting's date, but say 1550s, which was really the time that over 20 years when the Council of Trent met to reinforce the principles of Catholicism. They wanted to abhor Protestantism, show how central Mary should be to their religion and other basic points. And you see all that here. The only detail we got is a portion of the cross. You know, life is pretty miserable, and it's very much a painting painted in support of the Council of Trent. And you look across here at Van Clever, who, and I know I'm comparing death and birth, so it's a bit unfair, but there's still an analogy between Catholicism and Protestantism and the kind of huge cultural void, because you've got all this lovely background, you've got the flowers at the front, the joy of the young mother. It's a very happy and very different painting. And Van Clever, both those are upstairs, and Van Clever actually painted the second best known portrait of Henry VIII at the time as well. But I think he's doing something obviously very religious, but expressing something beyond narrow propaganda and this interest in the outside world there. Another subversive, William Hogarth, one of our famous Hogarthian paintings. These four judges, we know their names, not sure which is which, but they're Joel, Wiles, Bathurst and Clive, but Wiles was known as the hanging judge, and he's got the black cap, so I should think that is this chap. And it's not just the moralising art that we know Hogarth for, with Marriage a la Mode and the Gin Street and Beer Street or whatever, but it's actually more than that. It's knocking society, obviously, isn't it? And it's interesting that he could do it. He didn't have any patrons initially. He was the son of an unsuccessful entrepreneur. His dad had been in the Carey Street locked up for bad debts, and his father had started a chain of coffee shops for where you all had to speak Latin. So it's not obviously a great business proposition, but then you think Mr. Lloyd had a good idea with insurance being done and Mr. White with gambling. So anyway, it didn't work. So he had an underprivileged background in that sense. He couldn't find patrons. So what he did was find topics to paint, Lord Lovat, and would then make prints of them. And Lord Lovat's a wonderful example in that he, Lord Lovat was a nasty character who'd betrayed every side several times up during the Second Jacobite Rebellion. He was caught in 1745, transported to London to be executed, and he stopped overnight near here, St Albans, in 1746-7, and Hogarth went up to see him in the White Hart Inn, which I looked up was still there. I don't know St Albans. I think there was a battle there as well, actually, with the Wars of the Roses, 2 battles. But Lovat stayed in this inn. Hogarth came to see him, painted his painting, and by the time he was executed a month later, had hundreds of copies printed so that they could be sold at the public execution, and it was the last execution we had. So this is an alternative. It did give you a certain freedom, and he certainly used it. And where you have the freedom, I think you see the artist being able to do what he wants. This is a charming picture of Hogarth's servants at the end of his life. This is it amused me. This is a print of lectures at universities he gave. He showed, and pick out certain characters. I hope they're paying more attention to them. And this is a lovely painting, and it comes back to a couple of hours, but this is the Shrimp Girl at the National Gallery. And you can't say there's any propaganda, can you, in that? And it reminds me of the Frantz House we have up here, very same limited palette of colours, broad brushstrokes, which again is reflected in Degas again, and that one as well is upstairs. I thought there was a bit of a connection between them. Hogarth ended up as an establishment member. He became, a couple of years before he died in 1759, he became the sergeant painter to the king. But it had been taking him a long time to acquire the acceptance from the establishment. Want to finish with a couple of French painters that we have upstairs. Jericho died about age 30, famous for this painting of La Méduse. The Medusa, it was a kind of pre-Dreyfus style French scandal when the captain of a ship abandoned his crew and passengers, and he recorded this. He was a painter, as I say, of catastrophe, and the one we have upstairs is this wounded soldiers in a cart. And it's the most lovely painting. Quite a lot of books on kind of the 1812 retreat from Moscow feature this picture. And you say they're almost faceless. You don't know whether they're dead. And that, as well, is a propaganda from people who recognise the horror of war. And that's certainly not the pro-establishment, pro-established church background that we would have had earlier. Delacroix, another one upstairs. We have this odalisque, which is a painting I don't really understand. It refers to it as a symbol of women, having to serve men from a Turkish harem. But again, he was painting in a traditional kind of way against the state, when in the 1830s he did this famous picture, which is in Paris, Liberty Leading the People, and that was unsuccessful in as much as the picture merely recorded the transition from one monarchy to another monarchy. Louis Philippe came in, and the picture was then taken out of public display. It was thought to be too provocative. So you see, really, the genie is out of the bottle. They're unable to control what the artists are going to paint. And I was intrigued to see that he'd painted a bed, an unmade bed. And there were quite a few of them then, I discovered. And going back home last night on the radio, I was listening to Tracey Emin of the famous bed of our time. It just made me laugh. Again, I don't see propaganda in that. It's on tour, you may be pleased to know, going around all many of the cities with her. It changes each day, each exhibition, the different pillar arrangement or whatever. And I heard her say that when she was paid $100,000 by Saatchi, what her friends asked what she'd do with the money, she went out and brought a proper bed with decent sheets. And since then, it sold last year for 2.4 million, but that just convinces me what a mad world it is and how we're better off looking at pre-20th century art. Another one in the 20th century, William Nicholson, which is out upstairs in, I think, Gallery 1, as you come up the stairs on the right-hand side. And this is, if you like, subversive, or it's anti-propaganda. Armistice Night, 1918. You can see here people celebrating, you see, and I've lit them up there on the climbing up precariously. But over here, you have two men on crutches, wounded. And Nicholson's son had just been killed at the tail end of the war. His wife had just died. And I think you have art really as private propaganda, not for the state. Other pieces upstairs, we have these pictures which the Fitz uses, I think the Friends use on their publicity sometimes. Fantin Latour. I don't see how you can call those propaganda or can use them to support Orwell's view that all art is propaganda any more you can with Renoir or that lovely Cézanne painting that's out now in the Impressionists exhibition, as is this painting, which I put up there because it hasn't, to my knowledge, been out that long, and I'm sure I find it hard to find any politics in that, but unless you know it, you'd be hard to place the painter, I suggest, until I showed you this by Van Gogh. It's one of his early periods, this one up here, which I think is astonishingly different. So you've got other pictures. Incidentally, if you go to the DurandRuel exhibitionist exhibition in London at the National Gallery at the moment. It's got 5 of these poplar trees. Poplars were painted, they were the symbol of the French, the symbol of liberty as well, actually. And there's a 5th, but ours isn't out there. So I'd long to be interested to ask someone here, you know, why weren't we asked for the 6th, or were we asked and we said no? But this is upstairs, and what he was trying to do in some of the titles I put there in the sun, sunrise, autumn, wind affecting grey. I can't see George Orwell convincing me that that was propaganda. I just wanted to show you some of the books I've been looking at recently. This one, that's a bit disappointing, it's just come out, you may have noticed. There's a book on Shakespeare, which says it's all a Catholic plot, what he was doing. This was quite fun, talking about the rape of Europe. And the one I do admire is Timothy Brooke on the right. So he deserves a little spin, because he's such a wonderful, he's an expert in matters Chinese, but he writes on other stuff, and he writes about Vermeer's hat. And it's interesting because the hat, he's telling you what's significant in the painting beyond just the kind of broad message which hits you. And the message here is that hats in 17th century Holland, Europe, were terribly expensive. They were beaver hats, and it's apparently the driving reason that we went to colonise northern Canada, to get hold of this beaver. Presumably a big broad hat didn't kind of flop when it got wet. And when we acquired the painting with Frans Hals I showed you, the kind of Cavalier type one, the hat was painted out, a bit like the robes around the Palma Vecchio painting upstairs as well, you know, to save our blushes. And it's been put back. So it just shows you how important these, in his books, he writes chapters on individual artists. So to summarise, propaganda, is it a progression? I think it's a progression from pure propaganda, as we saw at the beginning, to artistic independence. In the early Renaissance, the church or powerful patrons were all consuming. You didn't have a chance to be independent. You get, in the High Renaissance, a hint of an opportunity to be independent and express. The heavy hand of the Catholic Church was still there, fought off by the Dutch in the northern counties of Holland, and then later here with people like Hogarth, and that coincided with new technology of printing and new wealth of the middle classes to be able to buy his paints. And the common denominator, I think, to getting away from that propaganda is wealth, new patrons, and pluralism in society. And then you're left then with paintings like this that I defy people to argue and convince me are propagandist. Thank you for listening. That's it.